record. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frank Zacarri, and you are watching Life Altering Events. Now, I'm going to start this show with a very shameless self-promotion. Okay, I have written my 6th book, which is just starting the editing process. So we don't know how long that's going to take, but it's coming. And the book is called The Secret to Walking on Water is to Know Where the Rocks Are. And it's a guide for every entrepreneur, anyone who leads any kind of an organization. As you're going to see many times throughout the guide, success is simply not working harder. It's not what you know that's going to make you successful. It's also about what you don't know. What you know is not nearly as important as who you know. Do you know the right people? Do they have the right contacts? The secret to walking on water is to know where the rocks are. And too many of us, when we start an organization, we sink because we don't know what we don't know. And this guide will help you prepare for what you don't know. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about regaining your power. Now, we've all had situations and environments that were not in our best interest. It might have been a dysfunctional family, being bullied at school, bad marriage or bad relationship, rejection for a belief or a lifestyle, a bad habit, maybe an addiction. Now, all these situations left us hurting, left us frustrated, left us depressed, and many times isolated. Yet many people are unable to break away from these toxic environments, which leads to the question, why? Well, I had the opportunity to speak with a recovering addict and a domestic abuse victim when I was writing my book, Storm Seed, and she provided an interesting insight as to why. This is what she told me. Life is hard, and it's certainly not fair. It takes extraordinary courage and strength to navigate through the obstacles life drops in our way. Many of us try to navigate these obstacles alone. And then she said, why do we do that? And then she said, I wish I had an answer. I don't. I have a theory, however. And that theory is many of us have been hurt or betrayed or abandoned by the people that we are supposed to trust and the people who we're supposed to have our best interest. We no longer have faith or trust in people. Now, as we try to navigate this alone, we make wrong choices and we surround ourselves with the wrong people, and this makes the situation worse. Now, my guest today is JoAnna Bennett, and she knows what this woman is talking about. What this woman told me in the interview is true because she lived it. However, JoAnna found the courage to stare down misery. She found support, and she's rebuilt her life and regained her power. So let me tell you something about JoAnna very quickly. JoAnna is a working mother of 2 wonderful human beings, as she said. She's an avid writer. She calls herself a neophyte, avid reader. She calls herself a neophyte writer, but she's an excellent writer. There's just no question about it. She's an insatiable learner, and she's a self-acknowledged survivor. She works as a full-time as a partner with O'Brien Communications Group. It's a firm that helps companies position their brands effectively and persuasively. Now, I cannot do her story justice, so let me bring her in. JoAnna, welcome to Life Altering Events.
Hi, Frank. How are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm so glad you're here, all the way from the East Coast. Is that right?
That's right.
So we're in Connecticut and San Diego today. Now, JoAnna, you are, whether you want to believe it or not, admit it or not, you're an extraordinary writer.
Thank you.
And you wrote an article about your early life, and you started with a quote, and I hope I don't butcher his name here, from Carl Gustav Jung. And he said, you wrote, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Tell us about your darkness.
Oh, there's plenty of darkness over here, Frank. I would say it all kind of started when I was young. I grew up in an area in New Jersey, so I currently live in Connecticut, but that's not where I was born and raised. I was born and raised in New Jersey, in a town that was not very, I guess I'll say good. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of different things that went on, gang activity in my town. And when you're kind of involved in that kind of environment, that's kind of what you know. It's almost like a small world, I would say. So there is a big world picture regardless of where you are, but I was in my small world. I grew up in a family who tried their best. My parents were good people. They worked, they supported me, they kept a roof over my head. But my father still to this day suffers from a drinking problem. My mother's pretty codependent on that. I also had a sister who had a lot of high needs. She was a very needy person. So I was the younger sister, 5 years younger than her. I kind of was on my own for quite a while. I didn't have that support. I didn't have the understanding of being loved. I never really understood what that truly meant. I always thought that being loved was just something that you constantly had to earn. It was something that you had to do good things in order to be loved. It wasn't this unconditional love, which is a feeling that I've since understood, developed, and kind of grown from. But growing up in that environment, it was just kind of chaotic a lot of the times. And then as I got older, I would find myself into crowds that probably weren't the best. I probably started drinking when I was 13 or 14 years old because everyone around me was doing it, which is really not a good, that's not a good way to say it, but that's kind of what it was. We'd go to football games and when we were very young in high school and drink before or after. We smoked pot. We would do anything that we felt like we could get away with. And it was pretty easy for quite a time. And then I did go away to university. So I was also, during all the chaos, I was also pretty intelligent. I could do really well in school. I was in honors classes. So I was always kind of a master of juggling. I would always have like different lives and I could just flow in and out of the different ones and successfully navigate them. I decided I didn't want to go to college at first and my parents pressured me. I applied to one university and I got in. So I was like, fine, I guess I'll try this out. And living away on campus, I feel like that kind of just exacerbated itself. I mean, you continue drinking, you find your crowds. One thing I do like to say sometimes is I wish I could find all the people that I used to drink with in college and get in trouble with in college and ask them about their childhoods and see how they were raised and just kind of find out now that I'm more aware of the background of why I did what I did and how I learned about my darkness and just find out if they were in the same kind of boat and if they've been able to come out of it as well. But I remember there was a time in college we got caught drinking in our rooms, totally not allowed. And they sent us to therapy. And we were all laughing about it. We're like, why do we need therapy? We're just drinking in our room like all the other college kids do. But that's not what all the other college kids do. That's just what we were doing. And we were normalizing the abnormal. That's kind of what I feel like you do when you get into these situations. When you're in your darkest moments, you're not saying, this is so terrible, I'm so terrible. You're saying, well, I'm not this bad. Well, I'm not doing that. And you're able to normalize and justify your behaviors.
Absolutely. That becomes a big issue for a number of people who are struggling is they're doing it too, or they're doing worse. Exactly. Now, you described yourself in an article you wrote as damaged goods. How did that impact your life? Continue on with the story.
Yeah, so I always felt as though damaged goods, that's I do say that. I was always kind of, like I said, I was a drinker. I would smoke. I would hang out with people. I would put myself into situations that I don't think that I certainly wouldn't want my daughter to put herself in. But I also did it because I just didn't really love myself. Like I did not think that I had the power to be anything except for what other people needed and wanted me to be, which is damaging. There was a time when I was in college, which is something that I've recently come to kind of accept as it wasn't my fault, but for the longest time it laid weight on my brain. I had gone drinking with my friends one night. We were hanging out with a group of people that we shouldn't have been hanging out with. I got myself into a situation where I had ended up being raped in college. And it was something that, again, I was ashamed of it. I was hurt by it. I didn't tell anyone for years, but it was something that my mind would go back to when I would get into certain situations that reminded me of it. That particular night it happened, and I could talk about it now, but it's one of the things that your subconscious doesn't always let you know. I was drinking pina coladas that night. Every time I would drink a pina colada after that, I would feel nauseous. I would be sick. It wouldn't be something I could easily do. I blamed it on the ingredients when it never was. It was my mental state, and it would remind me of things that I didn't want to remind myself of. But after that, it took me years to accept that that happened, accept that it wasn't my fault. I did put myself in situations that were not the ideal, but it doesn't mean that I deserve to be abused in that manner. It doesn't mean that I deserve those things. And if I was in that same exact environment with someone who wasn't that negative type of person, it wouldn't have happened. So I had to learn to accept that it happened, accept that that was part of my life. But for a long time, I thought that I was, like I said, damaged goods. Who would want to be with a person that had that type of experience and that type of life experiences?
Exactly. And I've talked to a number of people over the years, JoAnna, And one of the things that they have in common when they're in that state is that they'll say, well, I deserve this.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't care for myself, and anything that happens to me is something that I deserve. And it takes a long time to break that cycle. Is that what you found?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the unconditional love that I mentioned before. When you're constantly seeking someone's approval, you don't love yourself. When you're constantly seeking, well, I need to do this and be better, and then I'm worthy of love. And when that happens at your base level when you're a child, that's just the way that your brain works. So you constantly need to kind of grow towards that. But once you realize that no matter what you do, you're lovable. No matter what you do, you're worthy. No matter what happens in your life, it's happened to other people too. And it's not something that you need to be ashamed of. And the more you talk about it and the more you express it, the more other people hear those things and say, you know what, that wasn't something that I need to be ashamed of anymore. That wasn't something that ruined my life, but it's something that I can use as a platform to stand on and to get higher and to grow taller and to be
To
better.
move forward. Exactly.
And I think one of the things that really changed my perception on that was I was in therapy for quite a while. And I remember telling my therapist, and it took me weeks in my head to say, how am I going to explain this to her? What am I going to do? She's going to judge me. She's going to think I'm not this person that she thinks that I am. And I remember telling her, and her reaction was like, yeah, that happens all the time in college. Like, I'm sorry it happened to you. It's really crappy, but does that change anything about your life? And I'm like, no, actually it doesn't. And it never happened again because I learned my lessons from the things that I had done that were incorrect. And that's life. You make a mistake, you learn a lesson. As long as you can do that, what else is there to do?
Exactly. Exactly. You just pick up the pieces, keep moving forward. There's nothing
Yep.
else. The past. Someone told me one time, JoAnna, after the terrible divorce, and you're lamenting, right? And he said, "Man, what are you looking in the past for? There's nothing new to see there.
Yeah.
Move forward. Keep going."
Yeah.
Now, JoAnna, you married somebody that you knew from age 11.
Yeah.
Age 11.
Yeah.
All right. Tell us what this attraction was.
So again, I grew up in an area that wasn't the best area. There were quite a few bad boys, I would say. We could use that bucket, even though I don't really like generalizations. But he was probably at the top of the bad boy list. So it was something that I really liked. I mean, he would come pick me up on his pegs on his bicycle, and I would run away. My parents would be yelling at me to not do that. And I'd be like, bye, see you later. I can't remember the year it was, but Titanic came out in the movie theater.
Right.
And we were not dating by any means, but he had my beeper number. So I remember he beeped me. I called him from a cell payphone, and then that was the kind of person I would sneak away to meet at the movie theater. Tell my mom I was going with a girlfriend, and then we'd meet some boys at the movie theater. That was just kind of not a good thing that I did, but something that I did. But then I came to find out even years later, and it's funny because I used to laugh about this story, but when I tell it again, I'm like, that was such a red flag. But I was the 7th girl that he took to Titanic in the movie theater because it was a 3-hour movie, and he would try to make out with all these girls in the movies. And I thought it was like, oh, he liked me. But I was just one in his bucket of girls that he was trying to see how far he could go with it, I guess. And then after that, we didn't talk for quite a while because I wasn't, obviously there was probably one in the 7 that was a little bit more adventurous than I was. So he didn't talk for years, but then we kind of met up again on MySpace when we were much older. I feel like I was 24, he was 25. And then we just kind of grew in a relationship from there. But I loved the bad boy. I mean, he dropped out of high school when he was a sophomore because he was selling drugs and stealing cars. And that was kind of what drove me towards that. And I knew all the stories. So it wasn't like I was getting into it with these blinders on where I thought this was a different person. But when we did start talking again, he was in the military and said it changed him. He became a good man. He was reformed, and I believed it.
Now, your husband, I was in the military, and your husband suffered from PTSD.
Yep.
And from a traumatic brain injury.
Yep.
So what was that like? He comes back, he's more mature, but then he's got these triggers.
Yeah, and the triggers were difficult, but he was very good. At the beginning of the relationship, there was a different element, and I feel like in a lot of bad relationships, I don't know the right word to use, it kind of grows. So it was never like we started off and it was this like crazy, explosive, chaotic thing, or you'd run away in the other direction. But at first, he was very open about it. He would tell me the stories that he saw. He would tell me the things that probably did contribute to his post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was very open about the feelings that he had about it. We would talk about it. I felt a lot of compassion towards him because he was expressing himself and he was telling me these things that I felt like made him vulnerable. He also told me about the incident where he got the traumatic brain injury, where he fell out of a Humvee and was thrown car lengths away, and his friends lost legs, and it was a very, very traumatic experience for him. And just being open about it. The triggers, he would always tell me that he would work through the triggers. Anytime he had a trigger, he would look at, say, a ketchup bottle was one of his things. And he would say, there's a ketchup bottle. There were no ketchup bottles in Afghanistan. I am in a place where there's a ketchup bottle. And he would talk himself through the triggers, which is something that people with PTSD do.
Yes.
So I was very comfortable with when he first came back with the way that he handled himself, because it did seem like he kind of had it under control. It was something that I felt as though I was there to help him. I was almost his mini therapist in a lot of ways, because there were plenty of times we would have hour-long conversations about the things that he saw and the things that he did. And a lot of it was pretty, scary to even hear the stories.
Yes. Yes, I worked with a number of veterans, and PTSD, one of the things is these wild mood swings.
Yeah.
They would go from compassionate and caring to almost hostile.
Yep. Yeah.
So now you said you had 2 young children from the marriage, and things started to deteriorate. The mood swings became greater. At what point did you decide you were going to see a therapist again?
Yeah, so I would think that the mood swings too with the children, it got worse because I could no longer play that mini therapist role. So he would try to tell me stories that were bloody and disturbing, and the children were there. And I would say, you can't do this in front of the kids. Like, let's wait until later. But as you know, when you have some PTSD going on, you don't need to talk about it later. You need to talk about it now, or you need to not. And at that point, and I know you can't force anyone into help, so there was nothing that I could really do. But I wish that I had known now what I knew then to say, I can't do this, but it's not that you don't need this. You need this, but I am not the therapist. I am the wife. I am the mother. I don't need to also add these other hats on into my life. It's not my responsibility to help cure you of this. This is something that you need to take responsibility for. But I never did that. So I would just quell him, and then he would get mad. And then it was kind of very back and forth. The reason I decided to go get therapy, to answer that question, was there was a pretty big incident between the two of us, March of 2019. And I had gotten really scared, which was not something that was uncommon in my relationship, where he would start to swing with his moods and he would get pretty hostile. And I would take the 2 kids and we'd go lock ourselves behind a door in one of their rooms, my room, a bathroom, just to keep the distance and the barrier, because I didn't want them to A, see what he was doing, B, hear what he was doing, and try to give them some sort of sense of safety, which is something that I always didn't have as a child. So like, just to be able to have one of the parents say, like, this is where we're going to go, Mommy's going to keep you safe, go play with this, was kind of something that in hindsight, they should never have been in that situation to begin with. Exactly. So that was a fault of mine, but I did the best that I could in the situation that I was in. But there was one particular instance where he had not had his pistol for about a month because he was presenting with suicidal thoughts and different things. And I talked to the VA, and then he had talked to the VA and admitted that he probably shouldn't, because he used to carry a pistol on his hip every day, that he shouldn't carry that pistol on his hip if he was having these thoughts and feelings. So I had hid it in a place that he didn't know where it was. And he had wanted it. So he was pacing up and down the stairs screaming, give me my gun. I want my gun. I need my gun. And I got scared. So I called the police. When I called the police, that was his breaking point, because he felt attacked. Like I wasn't understanding him. He didn't understand that I was scared, despite me telling him repeatedly that I was scared. He just wanted to continue to get what he wanted to get, which was to have his pistol. But who knew what he was going to do with it at that point?
Exactly.
So I had moved out of the marital home. I went to my aunt's house, and we would have these conversations via text message usually. And he convinced me that I was the one with the problem. He wouldn't have screamed at me if I didn't hide the gun. When we had a conversation with the VA, it was a big thing. It wasn't me taking his gun, telling him to go screw, and I didn't want him to have it because he was evil. It was, we had a conversation. If you're having these thoughts, you don't need to have a pistol. So he took it as a personal attack. But we would go back and forth, and he would just continually tell me, you are my only trigger. If you weren't around, I wouldn't have to deal with this. You need to figure out your behaviors, and you need to figure out how to act around me in order for me not to have these explosive behaviors. And I believed it, hook, line, and sinker. And I said, you know what? This is the first time in my life I have no idea what to do. Like, there's not even a question in my mind where I could say, maybe this is the right path. I had no idea. I needed someone to tell me what to do because I just couldn't manage the stress load. And my son at this point was 1, so he was a baby. He was a year and 4 months old. So having a very young son going through all of this, my daughter was 3, so she was a little bit older. But I just threw my hands up and said, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. So I found a therapist. I went on psychologytoday.com, which saved me. I looked around at all the profiles you could read about each person. And I found someone who also had an Italian descent, which was important to me because my maiden name is Federo. So I am a
exactly.
So I found someone who had that heritage. She was into yoga, which is something I always like to do. She was into like chakras and different energies. So I just said, she's my girl. I picked up the phone. She was 2 miles away, called her and scheduled my first appointment.
And when we spoke, JoAnna, you'd mentioned in one of the initial therapy sessions, I hear this a lot, you didn't feel like you were an abused spouse. Why? Why did you feel that way?
I was not an abused spouse because it was my behaviors that were causing his reactions. So if I could learn how to control myself and if I could behave in a way that was palatable to him, he wouldn't be abusive. The abuse was only a reaction to what I did and what I brought to the table. So it was my fault. I did not feel as though his behaviors were just random because, like you said, he did have PTSD, he did have a traumatic brain injury. There were issues that were deeper than just a regular kind of, I feel like a lot of relationships that are domestic violence related don't have that extra layer. So there was an easy way to blame it. You know, these triggers were brought on and he reacted the way he did because of this. So I need to help because he has a problem. It was never because he's being abusive. It was just because of him having an issue. And I needed to be the supportive spouse and I wasn't doing my job.
Now, so many abusive spouses do exactly what you did. Yeah. They may not be being physically beaten, but they're being abused. Yeah. And they internalize it. And the abuser is very good at turning the tables. Now, you called it in the article I read, the intimate partner violence, IPV. Yeah. If I change, then he'll be better. Yep. Okay, how did you get over that feeling?
So when I first initially went to therapy, I told my therapist why I was there. And her first reaction to me was, you need to go to a domestic violence shelter. And I said, you're out of your mind. I cannot, I am not an abused spouse. I'm not going there. And she said, you need to go and just talk to them. And I'm a people pleaser. I don't know if you could tell by the stories that I've told. I am a self-admitted people pleaser. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go there for her. This is my first therapist that I'm going to take seriously. I'm going to take all of her advice. I'm going to do everything she tells me to do. And I'm going to go just because she told me to. And I went and I sat through the first meeting and I said, this is not me. There's nothing about this that says PTSD. There's nothing about this that says traumatic brain injury. There's nothing about this that says this is my problem. And she told me to read a book. And that was probably the most pivotal change for me. The book was Why Does He Do That by Lundy Bancroft. Mm-hmm. And that book changed my life because there's so many stories in there and explanations from real life people and different explanations on how abusers twist stories and how they make you do things. And some of the words were verbatim from what I had heard. We were married for 5 years, together for 6 before that. So for 11 years, it was verbatim the things that he would say. So once I read through that book, I knew that I was in a position that I didn't expect to be in. I called the domestic violence shelter again and I said, can I please have another meeting? Like my eyes have been opened. And since I read that book, actually, I stopped watching television altogether. All I do is read for entertainment. So that was another part I think that changed me because I no longer used a lot of distractions that I had in the past. And I was able to really delve into the why, the what, the how of where my relationship was with myself. Because if I had a negative relationship with someone else, that's only a reflection of myself. This is what I learned through this. If I had loved myself more at the point that we had gotten together, and if I had more self-reliance and just if I understood myself better, I never would have allowed those things to happen. But I didn't. So that's something that I had to learn how to do all over again.
Exactly. So at some point in a situation like that, you come to the realization that it just has to end. Yep. And we're both brought up Catholic. Yes. Okay. So being Catholic, you always hear you don't get divorced. You
Yep.
stay together, even though you're miserable, you stay together because of the shame that you bring upon the family and all the other things. What impact did that have on your decision to get divorced? Or did you stay longer because of that pressure?
So I had left in March of 2019. I didn't file for divorce until June of 2019. So even as chaotic, and the end of the reason that I left was a very huge chaotic situation. But for months before that, it was the precipice leading up to it. It was a crescendo. It was very slow, but it was months and months and months of abuse. There's no other real word to put it. I ended up losing 40 pounds. I am 5'8". I weighed 106 pounds when I left in March. I was having blood pressure issues. I was in the hospital at some points because my blood pressure was through the roof, which I always thought was just something wrong with me. I was trying to find out about my thyroid. I was getting all these things tested because what could cause this? It's not stress related, but stress does a number on you physically, especially when you don't understand the manifestation of it. But so being Catholic, yeah, you don't get divorced. So in March, I decided we were going to do couples therapy. So we did couples therapy until June. And after months of therapy, I finally came to the realization that this wasn't going anywhere. Every time I would bring up certain grievances, he would yell in the therapy sessions. He would belittle me. There were 5 sessions, all 5 sessions. His response at some point was, we should just get divorced. I don't know why we're doing this. We need to get divorced. And in the last session, when he said we need to get divorced, I said, I think that's the only thing to do at this point. And that was how we decided to finish it. But he was even astounded that I would agree with him. I didn't even bring up the notion. And he was so astounded and so nasty and negative, and just, he didn't think that I had the right to leave, is what it came down to. He didn't think that I ever would, because I hadn't for years. I dealt with all these different things at different levels, and I just stayed. But being away and not living together was a really good help. And then finally doing those therapy sessions and finding out that he really had no empathy, no compassion. There was no point in those sessions where he was like, I'm sorry that I scared you. I'm sorry that I did this. I'm sorry that you think that I hate you, or these types of things. It was always just vitriol, back and forth. And I would just end up hysterically crying, and he would end up screaming, which is kind of the way that our relationship went. But I just didn't want to do that anymore. And it was because of my kids, to be honest. I was tired of going behind doors with them. I was tired of them seeing that. I was tired of showing my daughter that that was what love was. I would go to bed at night with her and tell her we love him no matter what. And what is that doing to her? Like, she would definitely find someone that would treat her that way. And she would say, well, I love him no matter what. Right. And that was just something I couldn't do anymore.
Right. That pattern tends to repeat itself. One thing you wrote that I thought was very interesting, you said, use grows from attitude and values, not feelings. Yep. Expand on that.
That is actually a quote from Lundy Bancroft from that book that I just told you. And that's what it is. A lot of times people, they think that abusive men are just terrible, evil, mean people, and you'll be able to spot them out. If you put 10 guys in front of you and you went on a date with all of them, you'd be able to pick out the one that was abusive. No, you're not. You're not going to figure it out until you're down on your knees in a pile, because it's such a small incremental thing. And the reason it starts is because of their attitudes and because of their entitlements. They feel like they are entitled to a certain relationship regardless how they act. They are entitled to be mad at you regardless what you do. And you are no longer, like, I was never entitled to be mad, regardless what the situation was. Like, how dare I tell you that your behavior was bad? You're allowed to do whatever you want. I'm not allowed to say anything about it. But I think that also goes back to who he was as an 11-year-old. He would get away with doing all these different crimes and doing all these different things towards women when he was that young. And that was just something that he just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And then when he went into the military, it made him feel like more powerful. And it made him want to have more control, I feel like. And it made him have another crutch. So instead of just being this person, because one of the things my therapist had said was to find an ex-girlfriend of his and talk to them and see if this is always a pattern of behavior or not. And it was different patterns, but it was always there. So this isn't something that, like, I was just so bad and terribly behaved that this is the only way someone can react to me. This was just a pattern of his entitlement. This was a pattern of his behaviors. This was his attitude, that he thought that all these things were the way that a relationship was supposed to be. But that doesn't mean that I have to agree.
Exactly.
And that was what I had to learn. He can think that all day. He can think that today. He can meet a new girlfriend tomorrow and he can think and treat her the same way. But I don't have to do that if that's not the way I want to live.
Exactly. Now, you wrote a statement in the same article. You said, how do you fix yourself? How can you resolve the problem that isn't you when you're convinced that it is? Now, how did you ultimately regain this power? Because you've always had it, but now you had to go back and get
And I know if my therapist listens to this, she's going to tell me I did it all on my own, but it was her.
it.
She held my hand time after time. She changed my perspective on myself. So it was no longer what I needed to do to fix myself. It was, you're fine just the way you are. And I had such an adoration towards her, like learning more about what she was. She's a businesswoman. She wasn't just a therapist. She had 2 trademarks. She ran companies. She was a teacher at a university. So she was someone in my mind who was of the utmost respect, and she respected me.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that someone like that, I think she loved me. I'll say it. Knowing that she could love me made me want to love myself. Knowing that she felt that I was worthy made me realize that I was worthy. She changed my perception on that because I never had that growing up. And it's not like I said, my parents weren't like, they wanted to be mean to me. They didn't understand. They, like, now that I am a mother, I've researched attachment theory. I've researched the things that you do to help your children's brains develop in the proper way. Because we're all just a body with a brain on it. We like to think that we have these huge fates and all these other types of things, but you got to train your brain correctly in order to get the outcomes that you deserve.
Exactly.
And that's just not something that they ever knew or understood. So having someone, my therapist, who knew those things, she helped me retrain my brain. And I also think having young children, they say that the mother has a very neuroplasticity in their brain again. So it almost brings you back to childhood because you have to relearn how to live when you have a child and an infant. So I think that having them gave me the chance to kind of take a step back and retrain my brain in an easier way, because it's not something that's easy to do.
No, it's not. No, it's not. And I hear that from a lot of new mothers that, okay, now the perspective has changed.
Yeah.
I'm going to be different because I'm not going to allow this to happen to my child, or I want to give them the best potential opportunity to succeed, and they don't need to live in this kind of an environment.
Exactly.
And I see the picture of your 2 beautiful children behind you there. That's wonderful. Now, JoAnna, we're getting near the end here. So after all that you've been through and all that you've accomplished, what last words do you want to leave with the viewers?
So I actually finished this book, was another one of the reasons that I feel like I was able to get through what I did. It's called Inward by Young Pueblo. And the quote that I would like to leave it with is, true power is living in the realization that you are your own healer, hero, and leader.
That is perfect. That's absolutely perfect. We're near the end of the show, ladies and gentlemen, but Don Miguel Ruiz, he wrote a book called 4 Agreements. It's very similar to what you just said. He said, if someone is not treating me with love and respect, it's a gift if they or you walk away. If that person does not walk away, you will surely endure many years of suffering with him or her. Walking away may hurt for a while, but your heart will eventually heal. Then you can choose what you really want. You will find that you don't need to trust others as much as you need to trust yourself to make the right choices.
Amen.
Sounds like you.
Yep.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I said, we're just about out of time. I want to thank JoAnna Bennett. This was enlightening in how she shared her story and bared her soul for all of us to hear. And many of us are going through the same type of thing. Absolutely, positively. There is no excuse for abuse. I was in the military. I served the country. It doesn't matter what you did. There is no excuse. And you can regain your power. JoAnna showed you that you can regain your power. So if you'd like to get more information about JoAnna, you can contact me at my website or contact her directly. And I'll make sure this information gets to her. Now you can see this on ROKU TV or on my YouTube page called Frank Zacarri. And let me leave you with this, ladies and gentlemen, I do every time I interview someone. None of us are in this alone. And the secret to walking on water is to know where those rocks are. And today, JoAnna showed us where many of those rocks are. Join me again next week. We're going to discuss another life-altering event. Thank you.